Hi, it's Leslie Meredith with Breakbulk Events and Media. We have just finished up a session on energy transition and the role of oil and gas in that, which will obviously take a huge role. I've got Marco Poisler here, UTC overseas, with me in the studio, who was on that panel. Welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us, we hear all kinds of things about the energy transition. Can you put that in perspective for us? Is this, as some people might lead us to believe, sort of a very quick transition, an overnight transition, or is it going to take some time to get to our renewable objectives?
Great question. Let me first, before I get analytical, and say I'm a shipping guy. I follow cargo. I chase cargo. I love packing lists. I love the sizes of cargo. That's me. But I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Houston, teaching project logistics. And one of the required reading books, recommended books for major papers as well, is The New Map by Daniel Yergin. He became a legend writing The Prize, which was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, became a PBS series on the history of oil and gas, on the traditional oil and gas, and the entire history going back for 120 years starting in Pennsylvania. And he's written a new book on the new map about where we're going. And two of the takeaways I see related to cargo is that this transition, as you suggest by your question, for example, coal, we've been in an energy transition for over 80 years. And electric car, Thomas Edison had looked at it over 100 years ago, and here we are now talking about electric car as if it was invented yesterday and it's coming.
Yes.
So a lot of these technologies are not new. It's how they're applied in response to fuel costs and so forth. But if we look at LNG, even in this show, if we had Mozambique LNG and we talked about all these LNG plants, and we had a number of participants, carriers at this conference, talk about the fuel source, LNG being the fuel, and today now they're talking about ammonia or hydrogen. So, and we're literally only talking about 3-4 years ago. And this winter, the Europeans are looking at incredible natural gas prices in Europe. And
high?
Very high.
Very high. Okay.
I think if we look at globally, this transition perhaps in Europe, in many ways, for example, an offshore wind is ahead of the United States. But we've got also then in the United States this transition because of various reasons with population concern about climate and decarbonization. But globally, many other countries are challenged to transition from coal to, and China, for example, is able to put a clear hammer down in a 5-year plan and say they will transition from coal to LNG. Now, of course, they're also pushing for renewables. And that's at the end of the day, that's where's the cargo, right?
Right, exactly. So as we look at transitioning to various energy sources, what does that mean for cargo?
Well, the most exciting, and that was talked about quite a bit at this show, is perhaps offshore wind. That's really radical and long-term. And it's not going to happen overnight. Europeans are perhaps 7 years ahead of us in terms of where they are, in terms of the megawatts. If we look at what that will mean in terms of ships and projections, obviously offshore wind can get very political because there's many states and governors that want to promote workforce development in their states, and in the United States there's sort of an effort as well with the Jones Act now, with a very important act of Congress, a Garamendi Amendment to the National Defense Authorization, which effectively makes a monopile for the wind turbine generator a coast-wide point. And that's really, really critical for us to understand.
What does that mean?
What that means, and borrowing from the Outer Continental Shelf Act of 1953, which set the tone for the oil and gas industry, basically it also then applies to offshore wind, where it wasn't that clear. And that certainty is good for business because you understand what the government policy is, and when it's sort of in this administrative uncertainty and Customs making rulings, shortly after that, Customs made a very clear ruling. And actually many people don't realize that it's actually U.S. Customs Border Patrol that enforces the Jones Act. Marriott, of course, is very influential on policy, but it's the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, and the fines for any deviation are very hefty for not using the Jones Act. So what we always encourage is early engagement and planning, and we do projects around the world. There's cabotage around the world, and you just have to understand the rules. And Jones Act is the law in the United States. U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. I would compare it to what we have done, for example, in challenging countries in customs clearance in Brazil, in Russia, in Venezuela. In all of these countries, you've got to prepare for the classification. Well, in the United States, if you look outside, you also need to prepare classifications and make sure you get a binding ruling to get it properly classified coming in. When Customs and Border Patrol is enforcing the Jones Act, that's very similar. It's important to have that dialogue and understand how is Customs going to see this and be compliant to meet the schedule and proceed.
Yes. Now, as a project forwarder, do you take a lead role in that?
Yes, that's where we add our value. We enjoy to be engaged very early on the project, from the feed stage, to be able to understand and add our value. And also from a different aspect, the global supply chain disruption. If we look at the trade agreements from the disruption in trade agreements, you had some beneficiaries from Section 232 and Section 301, where some of the production actually moved to Vietnam.
Right.
And then we saw as well the NAFTA renegotiated today, MCA. So there's a lot of changes with trade agreements as well. So it's important to look at the duties. And should I purchase from this country? There's no question Asia is the workshop of the world. There's no question of that today. But you've got to understand the nuances of what countries and for what commodities and so forth, and proceed from that and be able to, from there, that's the starting point of the supply chain, and then we can look at the cargo flows and where the trade is coming.
Right. All right. So finally, just give me a snapshot of your outlook for Project Cargo through 22. Despite COVID, I have to say that I'm always an optimist, but there are challenges today, as we know, when we've got Project Cargo vessels chasing containers. Yeah.
And elevating the price, the normal market price for that. That's a challenge. It's all over the press. It's in the mainstream press, where, as I share this with my students, where Bloomberg is saying, forget the MBA in finance, get a master's in logistics. I'm glad to be teaching it. And that's where, because of this disruption in the pricing is so significant, and all the companies are dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that going to persist?
I wish
Crystal
I knew. I
ball.
wish I knew. I have to say that I think unfortunately we're in for quite a while of this until follow the money, until we've got all these project finance projects, understanding where the returns are, understanding where the refineries are going to go, and these long-term and projections can be made.
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces right now. Yeah. So thank you so much for giving us your insight. I appreciate it.